Well, hi, everybody. Here we are, welcoming Mr. Gregory Soderberg to the Kepler education stream. Today, we're going to talk about rhetoric and whatever truth we feel we want to explore. Gregory, Mr. Soderberg, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Joffrey. Good to see you.
So, Mr. Soderberg did not know that I was going to mention this first, but we were missionaries in Brazil for a while, and the Soderbergs were among those who supported us. And one of the things I like about Gregory, and I'm going to have to call you Gregory the whole time, because as we were sharing online, I mean, we're friends. We've known each other for quite a while.
That's right. Yeah.
I actually came across a Facebook picture of two of our kids at a ball dancing together.
Yeah. Yeah, we go way back.
We do, yeah. So then the reason I wanted to mention this, and one of the things I like about the Soderberg family is how involved and thoughtful they are about Christian ministry. And so I'd actually like to begin this stream by you, and this is going to connect back to when we talk about rhetoric. But I'd love for you to tell our audience what Christian ministry pies you have your fingers in.
Well, yeah. So actually, not very many right now. I am trying to streamline and focus. Right now, honestly, we have 3 teenage boys and an almost teenage daughter, and so I kind of see that as my primary thing that I'm doing right now. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
fair enough. Well, then maybe give us some history.
Right. So yeah, back when I was young and had a lot more energy, I was able to be part of a church plant in here. And so I did some preaching and did some with the leadership development there. And so as a teacher, really, it was a process of me really realizing that that's just such an amazing place to minister to young people. And so really, as I look back, I wish I had taken more time to really realize what an amazing job we have as teachers. So I just want to encourage everyone out there who's involved in education. It's such an important mission field. But then in the past few years, I was able to serve as an evangelist for our church. And we got involved in something called Safe Families for Children, which is a church-based, it's a national ministry, and it provides a place for families in crisis. So we were able to take care of children. And it's just a great way for our families to serve and for our own children to serve. And that's really taken off here in Raleigh. It's just great to see churches who are working together to really help those who fall through the nets, the safety nets that we have as a society. And for the past 3 years, I was able to serve as the founding academic dean of a local LAMP seminary site. And so that's a model of pastors training pastors and leaders training leaders. So our site here in Raleigh is one of the largest. It's still small compared to the standard seminaries, but we had a great group of people going through, and one part of that was being able to just build bridges between churches of different backgrounds, different denominations, even different racial backgrounds. And so I learned a lot about how we need to be careful what we say and how it's so easy to be misunderstood.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess in the process, all of those things. I forgot. I was also involved in helping guys who were just who were both in prison and also just released out of prison. And so I joke with people. I have been to prison, but that was just one time to visit the guys there and be part of this big Bible study that they were doing, which was just glorious. So.
Yeah. So yeah, the one of the reasons I wanted this to come up is, as we talk about rhetoric, and I'd love for you to give a pithy little definition of rhetoric, just to really put you on the spot. But just in that, that all these ministries that you've been involved in, we're talking about cross-cultural ministry. We're talking about ministry across the economic spectrum. Right? We're talking about ministries that, if you're preaching and evangelizing, then you have a large audience. If you're working with a family and children, then it's suddenly an intimate audience. So there's this whole breadth of necessary communication. So I wonder if you could, that pithy definitions are difficult and misleading, but I'd love a pithy definition of rhetoric. But then I'd love to for you to talk about what you learned about your rhetorical self through all these different experiences.
Right. So I'm going to cheat on that. I'm going to use a definition from the book we're using in our class.
Great.
This is called Fitting Words. Little plug for the book by a guy who's spent much more time teaching rhetoric than me, Mr. Jim Nance. But I love his definition because it covers all aspects. And so he defines it as the art of persuasive speaking and writing. And so right there, it's not just speaking. And so it's really any act of speaking or writing with the goal of persuasion. And so right now we're actually going through an old dialogue by Plato called the Phaedrus. And so in that dialogue, Socrates is doing what he does best by asking questions and making people think and also making them feel stupid. Like, wait a minute. Anyway, so he's forcing people to clarify their terms. And so he brings out in there that really rhetoric encompasses every act of speech or every act of communication that we perform. So it's not just for the halls of government. It's not just for famous people. It's for everyone who is trying to communicate. And so really rhetoric is about everything. And so you can
So you're saying I don't have to wear a toga and hold my hand like this when I speak? Is that the radical notion you're trying to introduce?
Exactly.
Okay.
You're right. So when we think about rhetoric from that point of view, then we're always doing rhetoric. And so really it's inescapable. And so yes, so back to your second question, what have I learned from the various ministries? One, I think the big thing I learned is how I need to be slow to speak. And I think the Bible says something about that somewhere. But as a young man, coming out of a great education and having read, all these great books and so I was convinced I knew a lot of stuff. And I thought that other people should realize how much I knew.
You had all this ammunition and you needed to shoot it off.
Right. So I guess the big lesson I've learned in all this is a lot of humility and just being able to meet people from other churches, other traditions, other backgrounds, and realizing so much of what we understand when we're communicating and speaking, it's influenced by so many things. And so we need to be slow to speak, but also quick to listen.
Yeah. So, when people think about rhetoric, they do, I think we all, even once we get past the negative use in our society of the word rhetoric, right? And, we accept a truer, more classical definition of what rhetoric is, we still tend to picture this, as you were referencing, these epic speeches. And, and if it's persuasive, then, like, for example, the connection between rhetoric and apologetics is very easy for us. And it was clearly very easy for your younger self. But so if rhetoric is persuasive speech, can you give an example that would preserve everyone's modesty and dignity from your time ministering to families and to children in which you had to give persuasive speech, but in a much more intimate setting?
Oh boy, it's hard.
I didn't prepare Mr. Soderberg for this question, so be prepared for some cogitating on screen.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Really, I think it wasn't just one one conversation, but it was a process of me becoming friends with a local Black pastor of a small Black church, and me just showing up at their events and just taking the time to be part of what they were doing. And he said this at one point, and he said that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so that was helpful for me to think about, that I might think I know I have all the answers. I might have read a lot of books, but I need to establish that that real felt sense of I care about you, and that opens up people so that we can have a successful or at least beneficial exchange of rhetoric.
Yes.
And so often as teachers, I think we really forget that we think I'm the teacher, you're the student, but we really need to let kids know that we care about them, and we're doing this because we love them, and also we love our subjects. But it's just so essential to have. And again, I'm going to steal from one of my teachers, Doug Jones, who has a book out called, which is over here. I'll grab it for you. It's called A Rhetoric of Love. And so it's just a really profound book. It's more for the upper high school levels. But yeah, just looking at how Jesus, how he used words in every situation, to meet people where they were, to challenge people. So that's what I think our goal should be as we use rhetoric.
Yeah. So, in light of that, in light of this, more intimate rhetoric, this rhetoric of love, loving the students, kind of the final question really revolving around rhetoric as an idea. I would love to hear what your hopes for your students would be, right? So you're going to love on them and use this rhetoric of love and just be a good teacher. Great. But then, what would your hopes be for them? And, as they leave your class and they grow. Now, before you answer, I just want to point out that scrolling across the bottom of the screen are the classes that Mr. Soderberg is offering. And we're actually going to talk sort of about, there's a historical scope to what he's offering. And we're going to attach that a little bit to rhetoric and just talk generally about them. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in right now. So please feel free to comment and interact with us. We may be able to interact with some of your comments and questions right now, kind of in the flow of things. But I'd also love to have an FAQ session as we get towards the end. So if you have big questions that you want to hit us with, then you can save them for that time. But feel free to comment and ask questions now, and we'll interact with them as we're able. So Mr. Soderberg, your hopes for your students.
Right. So again, I'm going to cheat. And again, one reason that I love teaching is because I love books and I love to share what I've learned from others. So I don't have a lot of ideas that are my own. I have very few ideas that are my ideas.
Nobody really has. Very few people have ideas that are at their own. So it's you've just faced that truth.
Yes. So I'm going to quote again from Robert Littlejohn and Charles T. Evans in their introduction to their book, Wisdom and Eloquence. And they're talking about the purpose of Christian education. And they say there is a twofold goal. And they're also drawing on St. Augustine. So again, they're borrowing from one of the greatest thinkers of Western history, perhaps of the world. Anyway, he says that our goal is to lead the citizens of earth towards citizenship in heaven, while instilling in them the desire to introduce the values of the heavenly kingdom into the kingdom they presently inhabit. In short, we aim to shape individuals who are both heavenly minded and capable of doing great earthly good. And so the whole process of Christian education is to give our children and our students the tools and to pursue wisdom, but also to really impact the world. And so that's my goal, is not just to teach them stuff, but to give them the tools to pursue God's calling in whatever they're called to do, whether it's business or being a mother or an artist or a chemist, all those things are under God's. We can present all those in a Christian way, and use rhetoric to share the gospel, but also to be the best of whatever God's calling us to be.
Yes.
And so,
yeah. So you're giving the students tools, but not in some cold clinical way. You're giving the students tools, having modeled them ideally in love. They modeled the use of them in love.
Right. And and just to add on that, it's been remarkable to see the students I've taught, and actually not that I've taught them this because I was teaching other subjects, but in their classes in writing, they go into college and they're just blowing the teachers away. They're whipping out these essays and they're being persuasive. They're standing up and speaking, and unfortunately, their peers aren't able to do that. And so it's unfortunate that so many young people today don't have the tools of clear thinking and clear speaking and clear writing.
Yes. Yeah, clear writing particularly is a bugaboo for me. Goodness. Yeah, and I went to a state university when I was young, the University of Florida, and we were all obligated to take what was effectively a remedial writing course. Like there was no choice. You were a freshman, you're going to take this thing, and it was kind of mind blowing. But yeah, that may be the future for some of your students to have to deal with some of that. So you're teaching from a course called Church Fathers to the Reformation, and then several general humanities courses: medieval humanities, Christendom, the early medievals, the Reformation itself. So one of the questions I have, and I know I said it was going to be the last questions about rhetoric, but you were talking about sharing the gospel, and I would really like to hear your thoughts on what happened because so many of the sources that we read on rhetoric, certainly not all, but so many of the sources are pagan sources. What happened to rhetoric when it hit Christianity? And is that relevant? Like, how relevant is that for us? What a word, relevant. I'm sorry I even used it, but how does that hit us today?
Right. Great question. And that's one reason that I love church history so much, is because there are so many parallels with our culture and what the early church faced. And again, we could do a whole session on that. But one of the first issues was, how do we as Christians relate to this non-Christian, these books, these philosophies? And so we have, on the one hand, we have a guy like Tertullian, who said famously, "What has Jerusalem to do with Athens?" But ironically, he was a trained rhetorician. He was a trained lawyer. And so he was using classical rhetoric to make a point that we don't need classical rhetoric, which is ironic. On the other hand, we have people like St. Ambrose. Right now, I try to spend some time with St. Ambrose every day, just reading a chapter of his huge book, which he's writing to the emperor to basically argue against the Arian teachings. And so St. Ambrose is using his training as a classical guy to use rhetoric to engage this false teaching. And so we have other people like Augustine and others who really embraced classical teaching. We have people like Clement of Alexandria, who maybe went too far and thought there was too much good in Plato. Again, that we can discuss and debate that. So from the very beginning, the church was actively involved in taking the tools of classical rhetoric and classical education and using them to train Christian disciples. I think probably the best example would be Augustine's on Christian doctrine. And so he basically applies classical tools to the process of Christian discipleship. And then later we go on into the Renaissance. Like, okay, we skipped over the medieval period. We can come back to that. But actually, it was in the medieval period that Aristotle actually became popular with his book on rhetoric, which is one of the classic texts. Apparently, it wasn't even that popular until the later medieval Christian scholars said, "Wow, this is really great stuff." And so it was Christian scholars that copied these ancient texts, especially Irish monks, while the rest of the world was kind of going down in flames with all the invasions and so on. So, and then in the Renaissance, there was, of course, a big movement to go back to the sources of the classical world and also the Christian world. And so, one of my favorite things to point out is that people like Calvin and Martin Bucer and Johannes Oecolampadius, I just love saying that name. So he was involved in helping to bring out the first Greek New Testament, and also bring out the first editions, or the first printed editions of the Church Fathers. And so these reformers were very interested in classical rhetoric. I mean, just read Calvin. He's a master of classical rhetoric. So it's made a huge impact on the church.
Okay. So you have a course called Christendom.
Yeah.
I kind of don't want to ask a question. I just kind of want you to handle the word Christendom. Yeah, what's that class about?
Well, actually, that's the title that Roman Roads Media gave to it. So you have to ask. No,
I have to ask them. Daniel's in here.
No, seriously. So as Wes Callahan says in there, which I should just pause here and say, so back when I was in college, it was just great to go to Wes Callahan's house and hang out with him. There was a group of guys who would get together to talk about great books and have great conversations. So anyway, he made a big impact on me in college, and so it's great to use his lectures in the Christendom class with Roman Roads Media. But basically goes back to Christ's domain. And so with Christendom, we're looking at Western culture as it's been really impacted by the church. And so, yes, it's an older word, and it's a very non-PC word. It's not politically correct at all. I mean, a Western Civ is not politically correct either. But yeah, it's just a fact. Whether or not you agree with Christian doctrine, the church had a huge impact on Western culture, and we should understand that. For the most part, it was a great impact, and so one of the things we really stress is that it was not a dark age of a total ignorance. There were, of course, lots of problems, but there was also a lot of really cool things going on.
Yes, and there was a particular period of crisis that it serves the interest of some to suggest that the entire medieval period was a terrible time. But you mentioned the invasions already. Things we're going through some rough times right now, and they make it rougher. Those things have they impact they impact culture. Well, so I actually want to experiment with something here on the technical side of the broadcast. Daniel Fukushon submitted a quote from Chrysostom, which is actually not even showing up in this entirety. I'm going to put it on the screen and see what happens, okay? We'll just see. Okay, yeah, it's not all there. But actually, I do want to read this quote. So here we have an excellent example of... Yeah. So here's the Chrysostom quote. It is this that ruins churches, that you do not seek to hear sermons that touch the heart, but sermons that will delight your ears with their intonation and the structure of their phrases, just as if you were listening to singers and lute players. And we preachers humor your fancies instead of trying to crush them. We act like a father who gives a sick child a cake or an ice or something else that is merely nice to eat just because he asks for it, and takes no pains to give him what is good for him. And then when the doctors blame him, says, I could not bear to hear my child cry. That is what we do when we elaborate beautiful sentences, fine combinations and harmonies, to please and not to profit, to be admired and not to instruct, to delight and not to touch you, to go away with your applause in your ears, in our ears, and not to better your conduct.
Wow.
As someone who delights in pretty phrases, that is like that's
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's very biblical.
Yeah. Well, and he's a great example of using rhetoric to challenge of the evils of his day. And so he challenged the rich and those who were not helping the poor. And oh, great, yes, yeah, you should all go watch that. And so Christendom actually, yeah, he used the tools of Christian rhetoric to challenge injustice. And he's a great example of being both a Christian leader focused on Christ, but also on helping others. And so this is, again, something that I want to help equip students to do. And another great example of this is Basil of Caesarea. And of course, he was born into a wealthy family, got a great classical education, but really took his responsibility to heart as a leader of his community. And so he used his great rhetorical strengths to just really convict people of not helping others. They had at that time a very terrible famine. And so he's trying to motivate people to open up their hearts and to help those who are dying. He also helped to start one of the first hospitals. And again, that's part of the legacy of the church is that the church started hospitals. The church started schools. The church opened up orphanages. And so if you're going to reject Christendom, you're rejecting all these wonderful things that we all take for granted. So right now you can go, just go to the hospital and be taken care of. That comes from the church. And so that's a great, what I love about history is showing where things come from. And so everything comes from somewhere. And it's just neat to trace where those things came from.
Yeah, I mean, and those, tracing that actually can help Christians today with their ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of rhetoric, but then also of knowing our own story as Christians. What can we carry into life and carry into battle when we study the church fathers, when we study the Reformation? Yeah.
Right. So again, when we study church history, we're really studying rhetoric because it's really the history of people having, in some cases, very intense arguments about things that really matter, and also things that don't matter so much. But it's a history of Christians trying to persuade each other. I'm right, you're wrong. My church is right, and your heresy is wrong. And so that can be great. It can also be very sad to see Christians fight. But as we study church history, we are studying rhetoric, but also we learn a great deal of just basic humility. And we can look at people in the past and realize they thought they were right. And in their world, this made complete sense. And so we need to, again, be slow to speak, quick to listen, see things from their point of view, and not just reject all of our brothers and sisters in the faith because they don't sign off on all of the things that we so clearly understand in the 21st century. Of course,
Yeah.
it's Lewis in his famous quote, why we should read the old books because they help us to see our errors. Of course, he wrote that as an introduction to St. Athanasius's great work on why Christ became man. So that's one value of this whole great books approach.
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis was also the one that came up with the expression chronological snobbery, in a more popular work.
Yes,
Which that phrase
sure.
is always stuck with me. And of course, that's what you're talking about: gaining the perspective to stop thinking that we're the apex of human thought.
Right.
Being humble, being slow to speak.
Exactly. But also, so I'm inspired by the examples of our brothers and sisters in the past, and so I hope that my students will also be inspired to use again their gifts and abilities, and to realize if God could use these broken messes of people in the past, He also can use us. And so there's a great encouragement that we have through studying church history.
Yes. So for those of you who are viewing, we are approaching the end of our live stream. And so if you'd like to pose us a question, now is the time to do so. I would like to ask you specifically, so you have a Church Fathers to Reformation survey course, if you'll allow that expression.
Yeah, so actually that's not entirely correct. It's called Medieval Humanities. And so it's for junior hires, but also includes such literature, philosophy, poetry. So also read Tolkien along with St. Athanasius. So it'd be really a fun mix. So yeah, we're actually using, we're kind of borrowing from the Veritas Omnibus book list with that. So
that's great.
So, yeah,
but then you also have a course that's specifically about the Reformation.
Right. So
I'd love for you to talk about that and the importance of that course.
Right. So that's actually at the end of the year-long course. So it's called Christendom, and that's also an integrated humanities course. So we go from, we start with Saint Benedict in the 500s and go all the way through the Reformation. So it's a huge chunk of history. But again, it's literature, it's philosophy, it's theology, and of course poetry. So we have Beowulf along with John Calvin. So it's just a great chunk of time there. So I'm really partial to the Reformation. I'm trying to finish my Ph.D. and it really focuses on basically I could go on and on about that, but it's all about Reformation stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're.
Well, I'm really so glad you were able to stop by. I just saw in some of our numbers that a bunch of people just seem to have popped in. So this is your last chance, guys, to ask Mr. Soderberg some questions. But meanwhile, Kepler.education. And we've got all our teachers listed there. There's an easy little tab. Click on teachers. Mr. Gregory Soderberg is numbered among them, and you can read in detail the descriptions of his courses. And you can also read a little bit about him, his statement of faith, his profile, all of that. I'm really glad you're able to take some time out of your day to do this. And thanks so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. So long, everybody. Have a great afternoon.